If you're considering raising rabbits for meat, you probably wonder what is the best and most humane way to dispatch a rabbit. That's a question we asked ourselves over a year ago before we started raising rabbits. And in this video, I'll share with you the 4 best methods, most humane methods that I'm aware of, and the one that we picked at the end of the day, and all the reasons why we picked the one we did and discarded some of the others. So let's get right to it with number 1, a captive bolt. Captive bolt is a device that uses, as the name implies, a bolt to instantly disrupt the brain function when applied correctly or to the correct location of the head. And it's fairly straightforward, kind of looks like a bigger pen. You hold it to the skull, push a button, the bolt gets through, penetrates the skull, and damages the brain, rendering the animal basically lifeless at that point. Now, the advantage of that approach is it's quick and painless, if done correctly, as with all of the methods, obviously. And the second, I think the biggest advantage really of the bolt or captive bolt approach is that the heart of the animal will continue beating. So that means you get a better bleeding performance. So when you bleed the animal, then more of the blood gets out of the meat because the heart keeps pumping and pumps the blood out. And that leads to less gamey tasting meat. We'll talk about it in a little bit because I'm not convinced it's a great advantage, but nonetheless, it's one of the main reasons why people like captive bolts. The disadvantage of a captive bolt is that it requires special equipment, so you need to get a captive bolt. It's not super expensive, but nonetheless, it's another tool, another gadget you need to get. There is a potential risk of malfunctioning. It causes suffering, obviously, if not done correctly, even though, that applies with all of the methods, really. So this is not unique to the captive bolt, but I think the big advantage is you want to practice with it and you need to get another gadget to do so. Similar approach is stunning using a club. So a lot of people prefer that way because it doesn't require any extra equipment or special equipment. It just hold the rabbit by the hind legs and then smack it on the head with a wooden club. They have special, clubs to do exactly that, but a big stick, piece of wood is going to do the trick. Obviously, you don't want to smash it too hard to, crush the skull. It just needs to be enough to stun the animal. It's also very quick and effective, again, if done correctly, when done correctly. And has also the advantage that the heart will continue beating, so you can bleed the animal better than with some of the other methods that we'll walk through next. Now, obviously, there is a risk of missing if the animal, flops around and doesn't hold still. You might not hit it in the right way. It might cause suffering. So there is, I think, a potentially greater margin of error than if you use a captive bolt where you have the animal maybe in your lap and you hold the head and apply the bolt, So a little bit, but again, if you're used to it, there's absolutely nothing wrong with choosing that approach. Number 3 is shooting the animal using a small caliber rifle or a pistol or a pellet gun even. And the advantage of that approach is, it causes instantaneous death, again, if you hit the head and the brain, more importantly, because the bullet is supposed to destroy the brain, causing the animal to die instantly and without suffering any pain. The downside of that approach is obviously it requires a firearm. Now, if you already own guns, especially small caliber guns, that's probably not a big disadvantage, but still, whenever there is handling a firearm involved, there is a risk of, accidental discharge. There is a risk of, you not firing correctly, you doing something wrong, assuming the firearm is empty. All of the things that come with, responsible gun ownership, obviously, play into that as well. There is also a potential issue of you not being allowed to discharge a firearm, based on where you live. There are certain regulations, like how far away you have to be from a public street, etc. So it really depends on the size of your property. Obviously, if you live on acreage, that's usually not an issue. But in our case here, I'd really have to stand in the middle of the property because we just live on just over an acre, and I have to stand in the middle of the property to be far enough away from the neighbors as well as the street to be legally allowed to discharge a firearm. The second downside of using a rifle or a gun is that, you typically don't hold the animal while doing so because you risk shooting yourself in the hand. So you likely do it at a certain distance, and there's always a risk of the animal moving, making erratic movements, getting out of the path of the bullet, and then you hit it not at all maybe, or you hit, another animal, you hit it in the gut. There is just, I think, more risk of something going wrong unless, of course, that's what you've always been doing and you're completely comfortable with, shooting small animals using small ammunition, So it really depends a little bit, but in our case, that would not be my preferred choice just based on all the reasons I've mentioned. Now, the second or the other advantage of shooting an animal in the head is that, the animal is dead instantly. The heart likely stops beating instantly as well. And so that means there is reduced blood loss when you bleed the animal then, and that can then lead to potentially more gamier tasting meat. We've not had that experience, but that's at least, one of the reasons why some people like to keep the heart beating to completely bleed the animal out. Number 4, and that's the option actually that we picked, is cervical dislocation. And there are different ways of doing this. You can use the broomstick method where, you put a broomstick over then the back of the neck basically, and then pull up the hind legs to break the neck. We use a J-hook, also sometimes called a rabbit wrangler. It's basically a device where you can, put the head of the animal in it and again pull back on the hind legs to dislocate the neck and break the neck instantly. So death is also instantaneous if done correctly. There is not really a whole lot of things that can go wrong. You might not pull enough. You typically hear, when you pull hard enough. I always pull a few times extra just to make sure, because there's no such thing as overkill, at this point. But it's fairly easy. It's fairly repeatable. And I think it's also fairly easy to execute for a novice, for someone who hasn't done that before. Like in our case, we never dispatched any animal before. And so that was the first time doing it, and it went flawlessly, at the end of the day. There was only one occasion where the neck was already broken, and out of I don't know how many rabbits we've dispatched already, but there was one case where the neck was already broken, the animal was more or less lifeless, but the heart was still beating. And so, I took then a rubber mallet and smacked it on the head to make sure that the animal is completely deaf and doesn't feel anything anymore. But other than that, it's fairly straightforward, fairly small risk or margin of error, I want to say, or a high margin of error. There's not really a whole lot of things that can go wrong. Now, the downside is you do need a J-hook or a broomstick. In the easiest case, you use a broomstick you already have. I prefer the J-hook. That's fairly easy. Cost a couple of bucks. We bought one on Etsy, but you can find it online anywhere. And with that, it's solid. I know there is nothing moving. It doesn't come off. Obviously, it's bolted down, and everything is as solid as can be, and this makes it, the dispatching as quickly as can be. Now, the downside is it can be distressing to perform and witness, because you likely see some muscle spasms. The nervous system will continue firing even after the heart has already stopped beating. You will see the animal, twitch. That's perfectly normal. It doesn't mean the animal is alive anymore. You can typically see, if there is no more heartbeat, that the animal is dead. You can see it in the eyes, when the animal has been dispatched. And you can also hear it, when you perform the cervical dislocation. But again, you'll see muscle spasm. You see the animal moving, much like a chicken kind of, after it has bled out already, the animal is moving. That's just the nervous system firing. We even saw the other day the intestines still continuing to move, as if the animal was digesting food, That was fairly interesting. It was the first time we've seen this. Maybe also because, we were relatively quick with, opening the animal up and bleeding it. But what we do after the cervical dislocation is we obviously bleed the animal then, because we want to get as much of that blood out for all the reasons I've already mentioned, less gamey tasting meat, less blood spots in the meat, etc. And we've noticed that even after the heart stopped beating, rabbits don't have a whole lot of blood to start with. And by just letting gravity do its thing, it's typically enough to get all of the blood out. We've not tasted a difference. We've never had a gamey tasting rabbit. It always tastes kind of like chicken meat, and so there is really, I don't think there is an issue. There is a reason per se to leverage some of the other methods if you feel less comfortable executing them. And so we chose that method because we felt like it's the easiest to execute correctly, repeatedly, even without having, a lot of practice. Actually, we had no practice whatsoever when we started. So that's the method we chose. We thought like, I have a good handle on it. I can always pull a little harder. I always can pull again, and I can do that within a split second to make sure that the animal is not suffering at all. And, I basically induce instantaneous death at the end of the day. And so that's the method that we used. Before we wrap up this video, I want to give you a couple of tips. And number one is to put your emotions aside. Dispatching an animal, even if you have done it already countless of times, like in our case, it never feels great. You never feel joyful, taking another animal's life, obviously. But, it needs to be done, if we want to have food on the plate. And so I'd rather do it myself than someone else. But, put your emotions aside. Whatever you think or you want to feel, just put it in your pocket, and you can get back to it then once you're done with the process, because you don't want to hesitate. I think the worst thing you can do for the animal is to hesitate, and to not do it correctly, because that causes suffering if death is not instantaneous. And so you absolutely want to avoid that and be as quick and as decisive as you possibly can. And there is no such thing as overkill. I mentioned it before, with the cervical dislocation, for example, if I pull a few more times and pull maybe a little harder than necessary, that's fine. That's better than not pulling hard enough and just causing suffering, Obviously, you don't, need to rip off, the head, but you can pull with a certain strength. I mean, I weigh 215 pounds and I'm fairly strong, and I give it really a couple of good tugs to make sure that animal is not suffering and is dead instantaneously. And obviously, respect the animal and the process, and be grateful that what you're doing is ultimately leading to putting food on your plate, So I never joke around. I don't make, funny jokes or whatever, especially not, towards the animal. I try to be respectful and be grateful at the end of the day, because you're getting food from that animal. And so that's something to be grateful about. Now, with that, we're going to wrap it up. If you have any questions, anything you want to know, or, your favorite method, one maybe that I haven't mentioned, let us know in the comments. We always like to hear from you guys, how you do it, what your experience has been, what's easiest for you and why. So let us know, subscribe, stick around. I hope I'll see you in the next video.